Hello and welcome back to another episode of the War Report, the last one of the year. If you're listening at the premiere of this, you'll be listening on New Year's Eve, in which case, of course, with the past week and a half, as I think all of you can understand, schedules get convoluted. I know that half of the show's production crew here, that being my good host GSP, has not celebrated Christmas yet, and I'm sure that applies to many of you in the audience as well. But Merry Christmas for those of you who are on the Gregorian calendar, such as myself, believe it or not. I know I'm never gonna live that one down from some of you, you included. But I digress. I digress. Uh, but don't worry. I know you guys are in the final stretch, and you must be as excited as I was just about a week ago. And
Well, I'm going to give you a disclaimer, but because one of my brothers is married to a non-Orthodox, we do celebrate it also. We get two Christmases,
wow,
and we also celebrate Orthodox New Year, which is on January the 14th,
that's yeah. You do. You've told me about that. But
and Saint Nicholas. I actually took the day off work to celebrate Saint Nicholas, which is a really big deal for. I don't know if it's a big deal for like the northern Eastern Slavs, but it is for the Southern Orthodox
in
Slavs
my experience,
and for the Greeks.
the it's not as big of a deal, but it still is something that is very much acknowledged for the Eastern Slavs, so to speak.
Yeah.
From my once again, I'm not Eastern Slav myself, but I I rub elbows with them a lot, and I can
Yeah.
tell you from my experience at least, it is of a pretty big significance, but not as much I would say as it is from that part of the world.
Yeah. I think because Saint Andrew is more of a he's the patron saint of I know the Rus, the Ukrainians, and the Belarus.
Yes.
So uh, I'm sure Nicholas is also important to a certain degree, but for us, it's Saint Nicholas that really predominates that region.
Yes, and with that nice little aside out of the way, before we get
Yep.
into the insanity of just the past, I don't know, I think it's been about 12 days since we've done a show. Don't quote me on that.
Yeah, it's been
But
almost two
yeah,
weeks.
last show of 2023. Don't worry, we'll have a year in review coming out sometime within the next week as Geo joins us once again. So that will be fun. It always is. Hopefully, we can break
Yeah.
5 hours that time. No, I kid, I kid. 4 hours is the hard limit for the show because I know you people will revolt against me, and rightfully so. But I suppose, with that being said, we should turn our attention to the Forgotten War and the developments therein.
Yes. So I sent you an overall map. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't have um, Krynky, but I have maps of Krynky. For people who don't know, who might be listening for the first time, Krynky is in the far left of this map that Constantine has up. That's where it would be. It wouldn't be too far away from there. But anyways, I'm going to give you what Krynky looked like according to Syriac maps on December the 18th. So that's coming up now. You can see what the Russians managed to take from the Ukrainians at this time. And remember that, this was a very tough fight. They had at least two times where their columns were hit very badly. I mentioned in one of the shows about nine guys, uh, a squad of nine men getting annihilated by the Ukrainians in this area. Um, let's see what. Now this is kind of contested because well, because Deep State has like this on December the 12th, which incidentally is identical to what it looked like on November the 12th. So I don't know. So of course these things there's always some kind of discrepancy, right? Um, but I'm going to go with Syriac maps because I'm not saying they're perfect, but they tend to be right most of the time. And this is what it looked like before the Ukrainians expanded into Krynky. This is from December the 11th. So you can see that this battle's been going on for a while. We've mentioned the Kiev Post having an article that they're on a suicide mission. There was that article by the New York Times, which basically the Kiev Independent was borrowing from some of the information. Of course, they had their own interviews with soldiers who spoke on the grounds of anonymity. And both of them basically said the same thing about huge losses. And they kind of, according to history legends, they cited him. This article from mid-December, but it might have been like December the 12th or December the 14th, somewhere around there. And I'll give you an update as to what this territory looks like now. Well, let's say as of December 27th. So this is fairly recent. This gives you an idea. And the blue marks that you see here, these are Ukrainian FPV drones. So they're bombing, harassing. This was a case of a small unit of 4 men evacuating one guy, and then another 4 taking over, and then they were hit by FPV drones. I haven't seen the video. I did look on Dima's channel. This is what is a military summary. I couldn't find it.
Yes.
But I only looked because he said it happened. So but nonetheless I couldn't find it on his Telegram account. But the interesting thing that's the news about Krynky is not because the lines have shifted very much. As you can see, they've shifted almost not at all. And it really depends on who you're citing, whether that's the case. If you go by history legends, as of December the 24th and prior to it, around the 20th, the Russians did manage to cut off 300 meters from either side. And you can see that, that larger pocket of squares, and the forest line, the Russians have captured. And now in this latest one, you can see that the Ukrainians have a few places where they can offload soldiers who are making these small boat crossings. And they've increased the number of men on these boats, which has also increased the number of fatalities. It's also interesting around this time that, of course, the Ukrainian the defense ministry basically said that they need 20,000 men immediately, and that they will need another 20,000 men every month.
And it was, Umarov had come out, and he made those veiled threats against the diaspora and was begging Western countries to extradite them.
I totally forgot it was him.
Oh yeah, the Aryan general that's going to save Ukraine, Mr. Tatar Umarov.
the Tartar merchant. Literally the Tartar merchant.
The only whiter man in the Ukrainian government. The only whiter man in the Ukrainian government is Kubela.
He's literally eating all the money.
It's
so.
Oh well. Such competent leadership. I'm glad. The orcs are quaking in their boots. I'll just put it that way.
Yes, very much. But the big news kind of around this area was the Ukrainians announcing one day that they had shot 3 Su-34s. Now, there was only one confirmation, any kind of video evidence. You can imagine the thousands of drones, and they can't show you the information. Well, the Russians did confirm that the Ukrainians did shoot down one of their Su-34s, and only one of the pilots managed to eject. The other one died. They supplied photo evidence and whatnot, and so I personally don't believe that they shot down 3 that day, but 1, yes, of course, definitely. Then a few days later, they said they shot 2 more. Now, the interesting thing is that the Russians stopped dropping FAV bombs across the Dnieper on the Ukrainian side as soon as this one Su-34 was hit. I believe they only spent 1 more day dropping 1 or 2 FABs, and that was it. And it's likely that it was a Patriot system or maybe an Iris, I don't know, that shot this plane down. The Russians have been bombing this area for at least since the spring and summer, partly because they were always aware that there was a heavy concentration of troops building up all the way from Kherson to the other side of the Dnieper facing Krynky, and even east of there. So then a few days later, the Ukrainians announced that they had shot 2 more Su-34s or Su-35s. Again, there's no evidence. Yesterday, they made a claim that they shot down a Tu-22. Tu-22s fired their missiles from the Caspian Sea. Like, it's just some of the claims are ridiculous. Like, there's always a little bit of truth, but they're also quite exaggerated. And you can imagine, because I think the theme for the last 3-4 weeks is that Ukraine on the front lines overall is not doing well, is not gaining, and in fact, it's losing territory. And speaking of losing territory, we can now move into Robotino. So this is what Robotino looked like on December the 7th. Prior to this gain that the Russians made to the northwest of it, was the greatest extent of Ukrainian control that they ever developed in this salient. So this is December the 7th.
Oh, that's it's pretty impressive because
It's pretty impressive.
I remember back in, I think it was right around the time Bakhmut fell, around the summer,
Yeah.
where Robotine or Robotino, I think those are the two different pronunciations. I'm not sure
Yeah.
which one's the Ukrainian, which one's the Russian. So
Ukrainian is Robotino.
okay.
Robotine.
So
Russian is Robotino, but the O you pronounce as an A. That's your
okay. So
that's your tradition.
I'll strike Robotino from the record, just from that one, just because I'll be honest, my understanding of Russian is marginal at best, but I digress. But I remember after Bakhmut, this is what they tried to turn into the great symbol of Ukrainian resistance. And that lasted for all about a week
Yeah.
before that. And I mean, there's some who actually still hang on to it to this day. These Ukraine shills who have dedicated what seems like their lives to this. You think we're shills, you see what some of these people come up with. But it was supposed to be this meat grinder against the Russians, something that was supposed to wear them down. And it went quiet for a while, admittedly, but it does look like, and I think this is a trend we've seen across the front lines, it's the gradual picking away. Ukraine has fundamentally, it hasn't, I wouldn't say lost the support of the West, because that's far from the truth, but has lost practical support from the West because there are just too many fish to fry. There are too many
Yeah.
crises to deal with. And Ukraine's
Biden could take care of the southern border, but he doesn't want to.
No, and that deal has struck me as strange. So I will give the slightest amount of credit to the Republicans. Let's not exaggerate this, for trying to do some sort of political leverage where we'll concede to the Ukraine question if you just let us put up our fence. And once again, I don't want to oversell them, and that's really what the plan comes down to. It's far from adequate to solve the actual crisis at hand, but at least it's better than nothing. But I'm getting too far in the weeds here. But Biden's gambit, the gambit of the Democratic Party, if you even want to call it that, is we need to help Ukraine win this war so Russia doesn't start World War III. That has been that's been the line here. And once again, they can't help but logically contradict themselves. Apparently, thumbing their noses at the American people on the border is more important than preventing World War III. That is, if we're to follow their logical conclusions, and once again, these aren't my statements; these are their statements. We would have to come to the conclusion that thumbing your nose at the American people, taco trucks, and migrant workers are more important than a third world war.
Yeah, apparently they are. And the other thing too, like what they're mostly upset about, right? If we let Russia win, we're going to have Russia on NATO borders. Well, I mean, you could have prevented that if you didn't include Finland
Yeah,
into NATO.
and what do you consider the Baltic states? What do you consider Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania?
Right.
And
But
they were admitted in '04. And
yeah,
what do you consider the plan for Ukraine to join NATO, or the color revolution in Belarus, or Georgia? Once again, these statements don't make any sense. And they also love to. Something they've done recently, and I don't want to go on too much of a side about this, is, well, Russia fought this war to prevent NATO from getting close to their borders, so why are they pushing their borders towards NATO? And look, they convinced Finland to join NATO, so haha, we won. The big victory of
yeah.
Finland, which was informally in NATO for decades at that point. We just signed some papers and made it official. That's
The,
really all it was. But I mean, I can tell you that looking at the political calculations of the Kremlin, which I do think at times are dubious. I'm not here to sing the praises of Putin. Everything he does is right. But I mean, look, ultimately, I don't think he's doing a terrible job, all things considered, when it comes to all of that. I mean, there's things that are left to be desired. But I can only say so much as somebody who's never even been to Russia. But when it comes to, I would imagine that solving the Ukrainian question, if they're able to solve it on these terms, which it looks like this war from this point onward, it was a rocky start, whatever. From this point onward, is going better than they probably could have imagined when it comes to actually real analysis put towards it. I would say that's well worth the price of having Finland officially in NATO, giving them the victory of a small military parade and some NATO patrols on Finland's borders. Like, who cares? Who cares at that point?
yeah, I mean, the narrative logic doesn't make sense. The only way it does make sense is this: NATO is comfortable having its borders on Russia in the north. What they are uncomfortable with is having the borders on the south, because ultimately what they would have wanted, and we stressed this even the first year, even when thoughts of Finland joining NATO first arose, which was in the spring of 2022, we said that NATO has been training with Finland and Sweden for many years. They have bases that they use, both of them dually. But what they're afraid of course, what they ultimately, like, what they wanted was NATO bases along Russia's northern front, and then all of Ukraine and Crimea, right? That would force Belarus into becoming like this tiny spearhead salient into Europe.
Yeah, we can actually. I mean, we can look at the maps from the
That
Institute of
is what
Study of War.
that's what pisses them off, is
Yeah,
that they might not get it, right.
and they outright said this in the Institute of Study of War article we read last episode, where
Yes, that's right.
I don't have the maps with me anymore. I got rid of those as soon as I could, but that is what they wanted. The only problem is they were talking about it as if it were a realistic possibility at this point. And I will
Yeah.
say one last thing about the question of NATO expansion, and has it done more harm than good to Russia over this war and solving the Ukrainian question? Ultimately, while I'm not saying that Russia is satisfied with the Baltic states or Finland or Romania and Poland being in NATO, it is tolerable. But Ukraine, by its nature, by how interconnected it was with Russia, especially with Kiev as the capital, it could be viewed, at least in that context, if it were to join NATO and embrace full westernization, as something of a usurper state to Russia, saying these are the real inheritors of the Rus, these are the real Eastern Slavs. Now, of course, they'll do everything they can to trample on that once the war was over, as we all know, and they're
Mhm.
even doing it right now. It You've seen this happen in real time with Ukrainian nationalism, where in 2014 it's we are the descendants of the Rus, we're the real Eastern Slavic nation, and now the Ukrainian nationalists are just trying to emulate Germany from World War II, as we all know.
Yeah,
There were
yeah.
always elements of that, but it's been any sort of claim to being the inheritors of that Ruthenian or Rus culture, it have been completely thrown out the window, because it's too Russian, and they
Mhm.
have time and time again pulled down statues and renamed streets of figures that they 8 years ago were calling Ukrainian national heroes. They pulled down the Nevsky statue, who they claim was Ukrainian. They would have 8, 10 years
Yeah.
ago, but now he's a symbol of Russia, so we can't have him. Just to show how incoherent it is. But getting back to my original point, Ukraine was the red line because of how interconnected it is with Russia. Sure, you can talk about the territory, you can talk about the
Pardon me.
strategic concerns, which are completely valid. Certainly, Russia did that. But when it comes to Russia's legitimacy when it comes to Russia's national myth, as it were. Having a Ukraine with the capital in Kiev being part of the West is very, I'm not going to say completely, but very delegitimizing to Russia, where it does call
Yes.
it's an attempt to get them to question their own national identity, both at home and abroad. And of course, the West is going to exploit everything they can with that. And that's really the Ukrainian national project going back to the 19th century. I'm not saying that Ukrainian is a completely artificial identity, but once again, it's an identity that has always existed on a gradient. We've talked about this multiple times.
Yeah.
If this war goes swimming with Russia, let's say New Year's 2024, a day after the show premieres, the white flag is drawn up in Kiev and Russia gets full control of the country, blah, blah, blah. In a generation or two, these people, half of Ukraine will consider itself Russian and will say, we were always Russian. If it goes the other way, Russia collapses, we're going to be, we were always Ukrainian. So when it comes to this, a certain segment of Ukraine, I would say, especially everything east of the Dnieper, but even some parts of central Ukraine, are going to be very malleable in that. And you're just going to have these Galician holdouts no matter what the outcome of the war is.
Mhm. Yes. Yeah,
But with
definitely.
that aside, I'll let you get back to the minutia minute.
Yeah. So I just sent you the minutia minute. So I just sent you another slide from Robotino. Remember that this was a very quiet front for many weeks, even months. I would say after the heat of all the battles that ran from June to, let's say, maybe mid-September at the most. It's not like there were never battles after that, but the main push was done by September. So what you're looking at is gains that the Russians accomplished December 28th. So just 2 days ago from this recording. And now I'm going to send you what they managed to gain today. So you can see that they've created quite a buffer zone about around the area, their main village, their main base on the front line, which is Novoprokopivka. So that is the situation in Robotino. So a lot of the gains that the Ukrainians had accomplished in let's say over the summer have been reduced. Thousands of men have fought here, and one of the things that you notice, you can see the two Sorovikin lines. The first one is an anti-tank ditch. The second line, the smaller line, is more of a ditch for personnel, but it's quite wide in comparison to some of the ditches that we've seen so far. In any case, there's a pocket that's forming. You see these two salients in the last two slides I sent you, and now there's talk that the Ukrainians might move out of this area. There's been a lot of heavy fighting. The Russians did have losses, nothing like the losses, let's say, for Ugledar in the winter at the end of 2022 and at the beginning of 2023, primarily in January and early February. Now, the BBC about a week and a half ago did have a video about this, about the Russian losses, and they claimed 400 missing POWs or dead or injured or 304 days. Right now, that is a lot. But anybody who's like following us or some of the other accounts, they know that's like actually a kind of like a normal day. Because if you divide 300 over 4 days, that's less than 100 a day. If it's basically, for every one dead, there are 2 or 3 injured, you're looking about like 25 roughly that are killed each day. Now, I've seen videos, and the Marines, the Russian Marines that were there, I think it was 152nd, they were complaining about being, left in the lurch, and of course nothing came of these attacks, and it was extremely poorly planned. it's going to contrast with the story I have. Also, a disastrous assault by the Russians in Kupiansk from the middle of December that we've only begun to learn about basically since the 24th of December, where more and more video footage emerged. So, incidentally, there was this Robotino in the past week or two. This is also where I believe a Bradley was captured. There might have been a Leopard. I know 2 Leopards were destroyed, including an A6. But in any case, the Ukrainians have lost over 200 armored vehicles in this area of, mainly Bradleys, Leopards, T-62s, T-72s, the Swedish variant of the German Leopard as well, and I believe 2 British Challenger tanks. In any case, so that is Robotino, and the next place we're going to go to is Novomykhailivka and Marinka. So this is kind of like an interesting thing because just to give you an idea why I've grouped them together, I'm going to send you this one. This is from December the 26th, so it's pretty recent. It's only 4 days ago. You can see the kind of gains. Those green lines represent gains by the Russians in the basically in the last few days and weeks preceding the 26th of December, right? Now, I don't have a map of it, but the Russians have managed to gain even a little bit more territory in Marinka. But you can see how these 2 places are inherently connected. In the top right-hand corner, that is Donetsk city. The first gains, the first salient, the topmost is Marinka. Below is Novomykhailivka. But if you follow the contact line, the front line, you're going to get right to the bottom in the center of the slide. And just if you keep traveling leftward towards the west, you're going to get to Ugledar. So the Russians capturing this area would cut off supplies coming from the north. And it would put Ugledar in danger. But it would also have the effect of reducing the amount of shelling on civilians in Donetsk city as well. This is where there was a very tough fight in Marinka. I think I might have mentioned this on the last show, where there was a young Russian, 23. His squad of 9 men were ambushed. They fought to the end. He had scrawled on one of the bricks of the wall, like, whoever finds me, please take care of my mom, my sister, and my brother. Then he gave the name of the town that he was from. I did see a video, actually, about a week prior to this, where you see the forces had lost contact with these guys, and they sent in another unit. When the unit arrived, that's when they found them. The Russians had managed to push the Ukrainians out of this area, but it was after they had done this that this new unit discovered their bodies. But I saw a video of like one guy who's badly injured, and he takes a rifle and he just shoots himself in the mouth. There's a compatriot next to him that to me appears as already dead. Now, I don't know who it was that shot themselves. I don't know if it's the man that we're talking about. In any case, what a harrowing story. So I'm going to show you the gains that the Russians have made also on the 26th, particularly in Marinka. And I'm going to make a caveat with this, and that is, you see the latest salient. Well, since the 26th, the Russians have pushed on the other side of that water reservoir, and they've gone as far as that bridge and then down. So they've actually expanded this territory since then. That gives you an idea of like, um, just the how and why. Yeah, here it is. Um, Marinka became so important for them. This slide will explain that once you see it. Right, and that gives them kind of effective control over this area. Stopping the Ukrainians did try to retake this area with 3 armored vehicles, but they were hit, and they retreated. And now I'm going to focus more on. Oh, sure. This is a better close up of what it is that I'm talking about. And this is also from the December the 26th. So you can see that they made a lot of progress in just 4 days ago. But I'm gonna now remember the first slide I showed you where Novomykhailivka was. So you'll see the gains that the Russians started doing as far back as December the 14th. Let me get that to you. First, they made like a 1.5 kilometer rush and captured this area on the east side of Novomykhailivka. They then began to attack from the north with demining equipment. The Ukrainians shot them pretty badly. But they managed to like take what they could at that place, and then right shortly after that, on the 15th, they then started to expand from the south. So they made quite a few gains here. Now, there is video footage of really heavy fighting here. The Russians had to fight very hard. There were losses, definitely, from what I saw, including a tank that got blown up. There was one column where after they dropped off their men, something like 4 or 5 of the infantry fighting vehicles were hit or damaged, and you see like guys running away. So that is from mid-December. This is from the 18th. And you can see the expansion of their control in this area. This is from the 20th. But it has stayed around here. This is basically where they are. Here's a blow up that I got from the 26th. You can see some territory that the Ukrainians that was in the gray zone that the Ukrainians managed to retake. This is courtesy of Web Union. Sorry, Web Union. What am I saying?
Guess the old accent dies hard.
Yeah.
Start a show with a Slav. This is what happens, people.
Now, this is the last one I'll have on Novomykhailivka. Now, above Novomykhailivka are some strongholds that the Ukrainians have built up. Now, there was a little zoo that the Russians managed to take from them, but the main hold is they have a town between Marinka and Novomykhailivka called Pobeda, and then they have 2 more strongholds in the forest patches, and then west of where you see this latest slide that I sent you, there is another stronghold. So it's forcing the Russians to just attack from the south and from the east. And like I say, so that's from the 26th. That's yes. So this kind of illustrates what I'm trying to say. This is Pobeda. This is from the 28th, so it's just 2 days ago. This is what the Russians are trying to do, is to crack this nut in this area. So very heavy fighting in Novomykhailivka and Marinka. And we can now go to Bakhmut. And I have an interesting map of the southern part of Bakhmut. This is a territory that Wagner took, but that the regular Russian army lost during the course of the summer. Remember that the Ukrainians refused to only attack in Zaporozhye. They wanted to attack on at least three fronts, and one of them was going to be Bakhmut, which I think, in retrospect, was a mistake on their part, because you're going to see with the next series of slides like why that probably wasn't a great idea. Okay, so this next slide basically shows. This is from, I believe, this is December 20th. So it's only 10 days old, and you get to see some of the territory from 10 days ago that the Russians took. All those little squares, all of them are like 3-4 days old or more. So you can see the progress, like I would say from the beginning of December. I think that's pretty representative. This line of contact was even further back in October and September. And this is what I mean. The Ukrainians spent a lot of men here, including the Azov Brigade, the reconstituted Azov Brigade. They came very close to Yagodne, or as the Ukrainians call Yahidne, which is just to the north of Bakhmut. So in a sense, if you look at the northern front, in the left-hand corner, the upper left-hand corner, since September or so, or October, November, the Russians have actually taken almost twice as much. So this is kind of counting just December. Now we'll see like the gains that they made. This is on December the 24th. In the southern part of this salient. Let me know if you got that. I don't know if I.
Okay, it just came through
There.
now. I'll have it up.
Yeah. Okay. So the red outlines are what was gained that day. In the north, you can see that the Ukrainians push back, but there is the Russians completely took over Khermove, which they never completely had to begin with. In the bottom part of Bakhmut, where you see the red gains that they made that day, that whole cluster around it, the Russians did not have. So significant gains around there. In retrospect, these are tactical gains. This is in the north in Bogdanovka. This is also from December the 24th, so about roughly a week ago. This is when they got a foothold into this area. And lastly, you can see that I'll go back to an overall sized map so that you can see. Let me just fix this. So you can see that what probably the intentions of the Russians are. Let me send it to you. Because this is the town of Ivanivskoye. Ivanivskoye is between Bakhmut and Chasov Yar. Chasov Yar is to the west of it. That arrow that they're going to, that's Ivanivskoye. Ivanivskoye would be an advantageous ground to take. Okay, it's on an elevated ground. This is, if you were in Ivanivskoye or Chasov Yar, rather, this is what you would be looking at, right? So you can see the Russians have to go on an incline in order to get this area. And I'll just mention, and if you look at the bottom of this frame, the one previous I sent you, they've taken the heights around Klishayevka. Now, what's all this for? Well, in this area, there is a canal. In some parts, the Russians were able to control this canal. This map is kind of a good representation of the gains that the Russians have made in the Bakhmut direction, all the way from the south in Kurdumovka, Andreevka, Klishayevka. You can see the territory that they gained around Klishayevka now. They control the heights around there. This is from December the 27th, so it's pretty recent. There were no territorial changes yesterday or the day before, so I think this is pretty up to date. And so the Russians would like to have this canal as a natural barrier. Bakhmut was actually a very important logistic hub for the Ukrainians. It supplied weapons all across the Donetsk front, and even up towards getting closer to Lugansk, around Severne and Lysychansk. So it's not, this idea that it's not important or not strategic was a lie, obviously. So anyways, that is what let's see what date this was. No, 24th. Okay, so that's Bakhmut. And now we can move to Avdiivka. And Avdiivka, the push in Avdiivka started way back October the 10th. I don't have maps from that era, like from that time, but I'll begin with December the 2nd, which is nearly a month ago. These are the gains that the Russians started making in the southern direction of Avdiivka. What's important here is that the Russians had to push the Ukrainians out of Opitne a few times. As you can see, there is a place called the Kvartal. The Kvartal, this area has like high rises and stuff, and it's generally very hard to rush across open fields and attack from there. So the Russians will probably want to go towards Severne, and you can see how in their gains they're actually quite close to Severne. If they can get Severne, which they don't have yet, that would be like a pretty big deal. And let's say this is from December the 7th. So we on previous shows we talked about how hard this fighting was for the Russians and the amount of losses that they had absorbed. There was drone footage that came out by the Ukrainians. History Legends had a kind of a frontline update from the 24th of December, and there was finally video confirmation of a squad of Russians. I saw a video of them fighting, but they were by a wall, and so they found 12 bodies in the snow, and that was fighting over Stepove, which you can see there marked, but that's the area there. And the Russians continue to make gains in this area, but at a with very heavy fighting. Since then, they've had to move out partially from Stepove. Stepove is not, like, I would not say that it's fully fully under Russian control. It's partial control, and they only have like a part of the east end of it. This is an individual. This map will show you further gains, and that is more current of the fighting in Avdiivka. This is from the 25th of December. And this gives you a better picture from the 26th of December of that northern flank of Avdiivka. You can see there was back and forth fighting for the filtration plant, which is beneath that waste heap. This is that large round thing that you see in the red area. It's in the bottom left-hand corner. So you can see where that is. Here's a better example. This is from the 27th of December. The Russians at this point have entered some of the areas of the Dakyas. I believe they've also expanded since then. They've taken the other side of the Dakyas. Yep, this is from December 28th, so fairly recent. Yesterday, I don't recall hearing, any more updates about territorial changes. So there you see the overall of Avdiivka from of the 28th. I'll just leave you with one more. And you can see they're trying to trap the city. Now, the interesting thing is Zelensky made a statement a few days ago saying that he expects Avdiivka to fall within 2 or 3 months, which is interesting because remember I said that I expect, when Gio was on the show, I said I expect February or March.
Yeah, I'm eating my hat a bit because I said by year's end. So unless they pull it off in the next few hours, I guess I am wrong. But perhaps that's what you get for being a little bit overly zealous on these issues. And I don't know, judging by the course in Bakhmut, in retrospect, yeah, February or March seems reasonable, especially as we move into a proper election cycle in America, because at that point the primaries would have started. This is going to become a very contentious issue. The funding for Ukraine, both sides, both for and against, are going to be very heated about this, which is going to cause even more of a gridlock in Congress because, well, I'm not saying the Republicans are being doves about this or anything. A lot of their base is frustrated with Biden's conduct in this war. So I do think, just to elaborate a little bit more on your point, yeah, February and March, as as domestic political issues come to a head in America, support for Ukraine is going to become a lot more polarizing. Therefore, it won't be cut off, but it will be put on the back burner for quite some time.
Yeah. The thing is, the reason it's difficult, okay, is first of all, you have to understand like a little bit of the situation that was happening in Robotino and how that played a direct role in in Avdiivka. And here's what I mean by that. Okay, so I'm going to send you a map. I've gone map crazy. Okay, these are the brigades that were sent into this area to fight. Okay, now the 47th is not mentioned here, but Cherovna, Kalina, and Spartan are like they're ideological. They're like the Azov guys. Okay.
Well, I see that Polish symbol right there. I'm to assume those are foreign volunteers.
No, they're not. No,
Oh,
they're not. You mean the 82nd?
oh yeah, the 82nd.
The 82nd is part of their air assault brigades.
Oh, okay.
Brand new. The 47th is not part of them.
Yeah,
There's two other ones. So they moved.
that's
I
actually the
think
first time I've ever seen their insignia. So just at first glance, I was like, oh,
it does. It
yeah.
does. Totally looks like the Polish, right? It does. It looks like It looks like a cross between the Polish and the German. Of course, what is more Slavic than German? So what had happened basically was by Russians increasing the pressure in Avdiivka and even Kupiansk, it forced the Ukrainians to remove some of these units. Now, the 47th is not mentioned here, but the 47th is one of those units that was moved to Robotino, right? This is another area where the Russians managed to capture a Bradley. There's also film footage of a Bradley destroying three Russian armored personnel carriers here, but there's also footage of two Bradleys getting wiped out here, as well as a T-64 up in the Stepove area of Bakhmut, just north of it, above the coke plant. So this is a huge kill zone for both sides, and um, Ukraine doesn't want to lose this area. And just yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, Zelensky went to Avdiivka to record a video on the outskirts to say that Avdiivka isn't going to fall. And this is what makes me think that there could be some political intrigue why Zelensky said Avdiivka will fall 2 to 3 months from now, and immediately Zelensky decides to contradict him, right? By going to Avdiivka. Now, Zelensky also went to Lysychansk, saying Lysychansk wouldn't fall. Remember, he made a visit to Bakhmut, and he said it wouldn't fall. He's done this kind of thing before. I'm not suggesting that every place he goes to falls right after he shows up, but Avdiivka is one of those areas where that's a distinct possibility. And I do think for the Russians, Avdiivka is actually very important. It is the most heavily fortified town that the Ukrainians have. This has more trench works, far more than even Bakhmut had. And of course, it's been the linchpin for psychological warfare by shelling Donetsk city for almost 10 years now. Notice also that there is much fewer attacks on Donetsk city. Now, I'm very sure because today, today there was an attack on Belgorod in Russia proper, which is, I believe, somewhere in the Kursk region. It is on the border, very close to the border of Ukraine, north of Kharkov. 20 people have been reported dead, including 3 or 4 children. They used MLRS rockets, right? And the Russians have struck back. Now, they've struck back a hotel that apparently housed mercenaries. And, that's one of the things this year that we've seen repeatedly. Remember, there was an attack in Pokrovka, Donetsk, not Nova Pokrovka in Zaporozhye, 2 different places. But this place is, Ukraine is crazy. There's so many towns with either the same name or the same name. Like Donetsk actually has 2 places that are named Konstantinovka.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Nova prefix is just new.
That's right. Yeah, and Pokrovka means like shroud.
Yeah, and I did just want to mention or reiterate if I missed you saying this, but the strikes on Belgorod were actually in response to Russian strikes on military infrastructure. They struck
Yes.
the center of the town, and then you said, as you had just said, I had missed this part of the story, where there was a retaliation strike against a hotel housing
Yes.
mercenaries. And I do want to just touch on this story in Belgorod because I think it really shows the fundamental narrative of this war coming to a head.
Mm.
And I'll start with the Ukrainian contradictions here. I know we were discussing this a little bit off the air, but I saw one of these Ukrainian shills on Twitter, I think it was, talking about at first he calls it Bel Belhorod in the
Yeah.
Ukrainian spelling,
Yeah, yeah.
and talking about how it was a justified strike because of just how evil the Russians were. And
Mm.
it gets back to this point where the Russians are orcs, they're barbarians, they deserve everything they get and more. But also, Belhorod is an ancient Ukrainian city full of Ukrainians that's under
Yes.
Russian
Yeah.
occupation, that's under Orcish occupation, which is the way that they treat everything east of Galicia. And
Yes.
it becomes this contradiction where they are simultaneously part of the Ukrainian nation, but also vile orcs. And they do this in the Donbass. They do this in the other oblast that Russia has annexed. They did this when they went into Kharkov again. after they took it back from the Russians, where it's just this constant back and forth of you're Ukrainians, but you're orcs, which means you need to be. It's almost like a line of civilization where you guys are orcs, but you're orcs that can be civilized by us great Western
Yes.
Ukrainians, but everything beyond that just needs to be destroyed. It's
Yeah.
but once
You
again
can tell.
it
Go
it's
ahead. Go ahead.
it's it twisted. I mean, every narrative is going to have a contradiction at some point. It's just inevitable. But this
Hmm.
is one of those narratives that just twists itself into so many knots, and you get this with nations like Ukraine that once again have not existed and up until relatively recently. I suppose if you want to be generous, you can trace. If you want to be the most generous that you can, realistically, you can trace the Ukrainian national identity back to the 17th century with the Cossack rebellions against the Polish.
Yeah.
The most generous take we can give.
Yeah.
And that's assuming that you view the Rus as something of an ancestor nation to all three of the Eastern Slavic nations. Once again, taking the most charitable interpretation of the
Hmm.
Ukrainian national identity that you realistically can. And but I mean, compare that to just other nations in Europe alone. The 17th century is it's 100 years older than America. Just put in perspective.
Hmm.
And this is what it goes back to. And nations like Ukraine, with that late of an ethnogenesis, so to speak, or I should say recently, because it's not exactly like we have a defined endpoint, and we have no idea when all this is going to end. I can assure you that. The one guarantee is the lack of the guarantee. How about that? But I'm getting sidetracked here. But you see this with other nations, particularly in Eastern Europe, that have a much more recent ethnogenesis, that have a much more recent national consciousness, where their narratives tend to evolve into self-contradiction much sooner than, say, the narrative of more history than older nations like France, Germany, the Italians, the British, etc. And I don't know. I just find it fascinating that, okay, once again, I'll reiterate that I understand that every nation is going to run into this problem sooner or later, but I'm still just surprised that it just happens so soon and that
Mm.
it happens on such a surface level, because some of these nations you have to dig deep before you start to see the inevitable contradictions at all. And once again, I don't think a contradiction is a reason to tear everything down. I not deconstructions by no means, but once again, I feel like with some of these national stories, some of these national myths, they can't even stand on their own 2 feet.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've thought about for many years since this war started back in 2014, and maybe culminatively over the years, I've been able to kind of define for myself what exactly is the process that's happening with these quarrels between them. And, if I use a civilizational model, um, yes, we understand when there are two people that are fighting over the same identity, they're fighting also for the future. Because the one that loses doesn't get to inherit the future or inherits a narrative of its role in that future that it doesn't want. And Ukraine is very adamant about this, and it has no generosity whatsoever to the Russians. It just looks at them as imposters. But let's take a closer look at the direction that they want to go. So they see them, they're very much like the Poles in this regard. They don't see themselves as having a very special or unique civilization. That would disturb some kind of ill-defined notion of a European civilization, right? Because anybody that knows this show for a long time or that knows me, I don't like Europe has had several civilizations, but there's never been a European civilization. That is a product of an older civilization adapting to the dominance of a newer civilization. And for the story of Europe, that is let's say, the older Greco-Roman, Apollonian, Mediterranean, Southern European civilization eventually being subsumed after it actually conquered parts of Northern Europe, which, people term as the Faustian or Western civilization, right? For Ukrainians, like Poles, they want to see themselves belong to the after effects of these two historical tectonic plates interacting, rubbing against each other, and ultimately the West. And again, that's northwestern Europe when I say the West. It does not include ancient Greece. It does not include Rome. Yes, it borrows artifacts from them. It borrows letters, stories. How it interprets those stories and what it thinks of them is unique
I would say
to them.
for just to speak plainly, it is the French and Germanic peoples
Yes,
is
yes.
really the core of that.
Yeah, yeah. Germanic and Celtic, Franco-Celtic, yes. Yes, absolutely. Romano-Celtic,
That's the
that
term that
synthesis.
Spangler uses for them, correct?
I think so.
The Romano German Romano Celt. I can't remember, but I know he has some term along those lines. In which case, once again, like
Right.
it,
And you can, I mean, um, the northwestern European civilization was the first civilization that got off and running as a Christian civilization. Christianity was not added onto it like the Roman Empire, nor did it go through this pseudo metamorphosis where, like the Magian cultures from which Christianity came. I'm just talking about Christianity here on a cultural level, okay? I'm not talking necessarily about theology. Rome already had adopted, domes and the other such from territories that they had conquered that were part of another civilization. Domes came later, but they're not really a dome-based culture, if you know what I mean,
yeah,
right?
yeah, and
Okay, so Ukraine wants to belong. It's very much an outsider, just like the Poles are. And they look at this and they say, I want to belong to this. In other words, they want to stay as a culture. They're not going to make that that big leap, that which is also a tragic leap. Okay, a tragic leap from culture into civilization. The West already made that leap. It began that process. Um, with its various families. Some were French, some were Germans, some were British. The British went through several wars in the 1300s and then later in the 1600s with the Civil War. After it does so, it then becomes a colonizing power. It expands. It's one of the families of the West, of the, let's say, the Faustian West, right? That process, that's always alive and happening in all other civilizations. And all I'm saying is Russia's the only Slavic nation that actually is in that process. All other Slavic civilizations, they're not even civilizations, they're cultures, want to belong to something that doesn't completely erase their history. It can preserve it, but they don't have ambitions to dominate, to redefine things. They don't have that spark,
and
right?
I suppose the statement's going to have a little bit of irony based on what you said compared just going on that. But I'm looking at how many countries throughout their history have declared themselves the heir to Rome when it comes to wanting to graft themselves
Yeah,
onto another. I mean, once again, Russia
yeah,
has did that at one point in its history, but I don't think it at any point seriously claims to still
yeah.
be the third
I mean,
Rome. But once again, getting back to your point, that these smaller nations, these smaller cultures, rather than trying to go through a transformative process themselves, they either want to view themselves as the heir or continuation of these other civilizations of the past. And once again, I think you touched on something really good here, so I'll let you continue.
yeah. I mean, they all do. When Russia says it's the third Rome, under the paradigm that we're working in, I know the arguments for why it's the third Rome. I'm not, but that's a different paradigm. So I'm not
Yeah,
arguing with
yeah.
that paradigm.
I
I'm
once
not
again,
going to engage in that. But what I'm saying is from this paradigm that I am talking about, right? All of them at that time kind of think that all they're doing is preserving their history and just trying to unite the people so that they can survive. But that that reasoning belies a different process, right? So for the West, I don't know how many people know this, but Sir Isaac Newton and the Polish, he might have been German, but in Poland, what was his name?
Copernicus.
Copernicus. Didn't they both like every civilization creates a math of its own, right? Anybody can learn a math, not every, but only a civilization creates a math that is particular to it, or an architecture that is particular to it, not particular to anybody else. If Faustian Western civilization builds some Roman building like the one in Washington, it is just LARPing. It's just LARPing. It's 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 them going back to an older civilization which their forefathers had already conquered or dominated or transformed, right? Or stepped in its place after its energy had run out. Okay. Um, so for the Muslim civilization, for them, their math is algebra. That's their math. Anybody can learn it. For the West, what was it? It's on the tip of my tongue. I can't believe calculus.
Yes.
Right. So Sir Isaac Newton and Copernicus simultaneously came out with calculus, even though they never met each other. They didn't correspond with each other, right? So it's a very deep process, is what I'm saying, right? And people are not, even the people who come up with this are not cognizant of it, right? Or they'll define it in a different way. And I'm just saying that Ukraine and other Slavic nations are not on that. They are not in that world. That's not where they exist, right? The Russia or the Rus, which would identify all three of these groups that we spoke about, yes, they created an architecture that was based on the Magian, but they made it completely their own, right? That's the first sign, right? And then you have all of the great Russian literary figures. It's still very much a civilization in its springtime, right? So anyways, what I'm getting at is this quarrel, the bigger metaphysical or esoteric paradigm that this quarrel is about is nipping in the bud this emerging civilization by being absorbed into the latter day Western Empire. And Ukraine may not realize it, but that's what it wants to be a part of, because it doesn't even have the wherewithal to go on a separate path. It doesn't even want to be outside of its concept of this European civilization, which I already described as the result of two civilizations, right? But what they are is actually part of a third civilization that has not fully been born, that is fully autonomous yet.
And as we had touched on earlier, you can see the transformation of the narrative of Ukrainian nationalists over the past decade, where 10 years ago, at the time of the Maidan, it was the ancient Rus were Ukrainian, were their true descendants. All these great figures in Russian history were actually Ukrainians. It's our claim, it's our mark on the world. And then, year by year, it just becomes more of a, to put it broadly, Germanophilia. Just, they want to emulate the West, Germans in particular, and they want to be grafted onto that. They want to be the eastern fringe of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also why, like a lot of, I have an old friend of mine, although we haven't spoken since the SMO began. I told him, I said, you love the Poles because they're subservient to you. That's why you think they're so great. Just be honest. Just be honest. I mean, if I looked at the totality of the kind of things he would say to, to sort of ridicule and besmirch like Slavic people from time to time, I know he was just, it was just bants. I know that's what it comes down to, right? Yeah, You want like these outsiders to emulate you, and they really believe that they're part of you, and so on and so on. And they copy your architecture. Gothic architecture is genuine. It is new. It was never seen before. It is like if you see a Gothic cathedral, that's the West. It did not, it came from there. It is as Western uh as calculus. Okay. That's how important it is. That's how defining it is. The pursuit of photography is Western because it was an obsession with space and vanishing lines, not the solid like the Greeks, but the space around the solid, which is why sculpture is not important for the West, even if you like it, even if you admire it. But painting was and is. So, anyways, so this process, right? Like that's what I'm talking about. That's what's happening. It's just that it's in a very, very early stage. It would be like looking at the West, like maybe after I don't know, the Third Crusade. Like it's still like far off, and it's hard for people to see that. But before we go any further, I'm
Well, these are the discussions that people tune in the war report for. I mean, look, there's plenty of great war coverage, and I'm not going to degrade anyone who does war coverage. Certainly not, because a lot of them help us put the show together. No
yes,
doubt
it's
about
true.
that. But once again, if people just wanted a play-by-play of battlefield events, once again, we're just a drop in the ocean of that. So I always like to try
Hmm.
to expand those discussions, not only talk about what's happening, but why it's happening, and what conclusions we can take away from that, which
Yes.
I think is how we've attracted the audience that we have. But actually, getting back, and I do think, as a tangent from the strike on uh, Belgorod, which
Hmm.
is where this originated from. Just once again, I do think that strike in particular is it warrants that discussion because it really just gets down to the nucleus of the Russia-Ukraine war, why this is happening, and what are the dynamics
Yes.
of this. And I just wanted to return back to the actual event itself, where it was retaliation on the strike of Ukrainian military industry. The Russian response, once again, was to strike the mercenaries. And going back to the narratives of this war, I think what we just laid out, especially with the idea of either consciously or subconsciously wanting to become Western on the Ukrainian end. On the Russian end, when we look at the narrative, not getting even into the grand picture of the development of civilizations, which I do think is a warranted discussion at some point, possibly on this episode, maybe next episode. Once again, we'll touch on that when we get to it. But the idea of fighting this war of unification, or perhaps some may say reunification, of these territories in Ukraine, where their retaliatory strike to the Ukrainian retaliatory strike was primarily targeted at foreign mercenaries in Ukraine, once again reinforcing the idea that at least the public perception that Russia is trying to create of this war, which you could say is accurate, you could say it's inaccurate. I'm not saying that any country is genuine or altruistic. Not that I think I need to make these caveats, but I will just for the sake of it. What we see with that is this does look like a nation that is actually trying to reintegrate territory that has broken away. This does look like a nation that is trying to fight back against a separatist movement. And it I do believe that while there of course have been some civilian casualties, this isn't a campaign like one might see in Gaza, where civilian casualties and disregard of civilian lives seem to be really a part of the project, something that is a feature and not a bug. And with this, just speaking purely strategically, it was a strike of petty vengeance that is ultimately going to make this war much harder for Ukraine, because the more they do this, the more bridges they burn with any potential negotiation that could have took place, not that I think it would have, with the Russians, and the further delegitimization of Ukraine in Russia's eyes. And at this point, I don't think that the wing that would have ordered a strike like this most likely could be described in the figurehead of somebody like Zaluzhny and all of his associates. were probably behind an action like this. Not necessarily him himself, but the people that he represents, the people that he would be considered the champion of, the more hardline Ukrainian nationalists, the more hardline elements of the Ukrainian military.
Mm.
Once again, they've made the situation worse because Ukraine is working on borrowed time, it's working on borrowed money, it's working on borrowed weaponry, versus Russia that has a native war industry, versus Russia that is able to successfully have mobilization waves. And we'll get into some stuff about the Ukrainian mobilization waves
Hmm.
in just a minute here. And Russia that it actually has an economy that is outperforming most of Europe at the moment, even though the Europeans once again are still importing Russian oil, they're still importing Russian goods, despite the sanctions packages, just at a detriment to themselves. We're talking about a country that really doesn't have the resources to throw away on these punitive strikes, just
Yeah,
enraging a country that does have resources to throw away on punitive strikes if it does choose to do so. And
it's literally
yeah,
about morale.
yeah, and
It's
I've
yeah.
actually seen some Russians talking about this in response, and understandably very angry about this, saying they should just level Lvov because of this, because they have no intention of taking that. They have no intention of going that far west. They should just level it.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
once again, I'm not going to sign off on that because at the end of the day, it's not really my war. But that's a sentiment that's growing in the Russian public. Just act completely retaliatory, completely punitively towards Western Ukraine for every
Yeah.
strike they do of that inside Russia.
Yeah, and that fits into what we were saying even early on the year before when the SMO started. And we all said that Russia's not interested in Western Ukraine. That's been reiterated. But the way that fits into, the larger narrative that I was describing, the civilizational narrative, is such that this group cannot be integrated into, this semi-conscious or unconscious civilizational process that's happening.
There was a time for that. It was 1914, and any sympathies that existed there,
Yes,
they
it's
were
over.
they were purged. Quite
They
literally,
they
they
were
were
they
they
were
were put
totally
in camps,
purged, and
and
yes. So for them, it's like their grand vision of themselves in the future is just integration in Europe, but with a better standing than they had as one of the other 26 different nationalities within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. One of 8 or 9 different Slavic nationalities. Yeah, if you include all the small ones,
all the
right?
sub and like the
Yeah,
Rusines, the Lemkos, all of those
that's
people.
right. That's right. So the next front we're going to look at, this is from December 2nd and December 3rd. This is in the Kremenaya front towards the town of Terni. West of this is Liman. Okay. So I'm going to show you what the Russians gained on December the 2nd. And then I believe either the same day or the very next day, we had this, which kind of multiplied that with a slight pushback from the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians, they've been very good about, like, they were very worried about, in August, when the Russians from Kremenaya to Svatove to the Kupiansk front, roughly speaking, Sinkovka, they saw. You remember how worried Syrski was, and again they had to move personnel from the Robotino and Vremevsky Ledge salients in order to stop the gap, right? And there was a very good article about a little over a week ago from Simplicus, and he talked about the strengths and weaknesses of both armies. And one of the lines that still resonates with me today is that he said, well, why is Russia not moving fast enough? He says, well, because the problems that I've outlined for the Ukrainians are the same ones that the Russians have, except those problems aren't nearly as bad for the Russians. When the Russians do create a hole, um, mostly because of communication issues, they are not able to always take advantage of them. And so the Ukrainians throw in more and more bodies in order to plug those holes as quickly as possible. And, this year we've seen that much more so than 2022. It's much more apparent than it was in 2022. So you can see that the Russians are expanding this area. Um, this is, I believe, from the 28th, so it's very, very recent. No, this is from the 26th of December. Um, This is a bit of a close-up. The next one that I'm going to send you. It's the same photo. It's just that it gives you a better idea. It's just a fraction bit more cropped. And you can take a look at the gains and again, from previous days, you see the pushback by the Ukrainians with that purple outline. So the Russians are making efforts on all fronts. And as I said, but in Sinkovka, I have seen kind of like stuff that's on par with what we saw in Ugledar on a smaller level, if I count like the losses. But holy moly, they made inroads. They captured a part of Sinkovka. This place is very heavily mined. Both Weeb Union and History Legends brought this up. The Weeb Unions was much shorter, but he brought up something that History Legends didn't know about. His video came out at least a week earlier. Now, I know both of these guys, I think they're honest, and they both speak with Ukrainian and Russian soldiers. So the Russians made a push there somewhere around December the 14th. And they dropped off a bunch of guys. I've seen the video in Sinkovka, the snow on the ground, et cetera, et cetera. BMPs, about 9 altogether, of a mix of BMPs and tanks. I believe 2 tanks, and the rest were BMPs, like infantry transport vehicles. Some of them have a decent sized 30 millimeter cannon. Anyways, they drop these guys off, and it's an ambush. There's one guy behind a house, a Ukrainian, and he fires an ATGM at one of the infantry fighting vehicles. I didn't see an explosion. In any case, they just leave these guys. One guy, his hand is attached. Somehow it's been caught on the back of this MPB, this infantry fighting vehicle. That's what the Russians called them. I'm pretty sure these guys got wiped out. Because they were just waiting for these guys. And I couldn't understand why would they just abandon them like this. One of the things I have noticed is that they're willing, like in this kind of a scenario, some of the Russian units have begun where they will maintain a certain distance between each vehicle, but not too far apart, and try to concentrate their power. Remember that they're dealing with drones. Drones, both sides have increased, even though there's articles in Western newspapers that Russians outnumbered the Ukrainians by 7 times in drones. They don't do that in all parts of the front. I don't believe that. So in any case, they dropped them off. This armored column starts to leave. I believe some of them were destroyed. Of the 9, I think 4 were damaged. You see videos of the men exiting their vehicles and running away. Then they send by foot something like a platoon. They hit the same area of the woods where this previous column had gone. They get hit with artillery. Then I saw another video where there's 3 vehicles, 1 tank with anti-mine attachments to the front, and 3 infantry fighting vehicles. Let me see. There were 4 vehicles that were already hit. Yes. And I can't tell whether it's a mine or super accurate artillery fire. And they're just devastated. They're just destroyed. The men get out of their vehicles. They huddle in this one depression in the ground. Some of them run further into the woods where there are some trenches, but the ones that are huddled into the ground, they're shelled with cluster munitions and with FPV drones. Finally, there was also a story of 2 MPVs with 5-6 guys on each, and they're hit by extremely accurate, according to History Legends, very accurate cannon fire. Maybe it was. I don't know. Maybe it was a HIMARS. I haven't seen the video. He didn't specify, but this area is quite a minefield. So maybe it was a mine. I don't know. So significant losses, I would say. Uh, it began on December the 14th. It went on till December the 20th. There haven't really been any gains. So the Ukrainians are fighting extremely hard around Kupiansk. And the reason for this is if they lose Kupiansk, the Russians will just go down the Zherebets River, and those salients that the Russians just increased around Liman and Kremenaya will go even further. But Kupiansk, Sinkovka is the way to Kupiansk, and that's where all of this happened. And then Web Union had a video, and basically what he said was, according to his sources, these guys were Z-Force units. These are, they're criminals, right? But it's very cruel. From what this source in the Russian army said to him was they didn't care to like attack, to shell the place. Because I wondered, like, why are they not responding? These guys are trapped. And in their estimation, it was their way of finding out the positions of the Ukrainians by not shelling them at all. So these guys were, it's very cruel. They were sacrificed essentially to get an idea of the strategic and tactical positions of the Ukrainians. So, longest minutia minute ever. Anyways,
I'm sure that is a false statement, but I digress.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to confirm that it's at an hour and 26 minutes with a total of 39 maps. So we might have a map number record.
We're not going to do this again. I've been wanting to do this for a long time.
Well, no, this is more than appropriate because this is the last show of the year. We need to cover all our bases.
We're not going to do this all the time.
We hate to disappoint you, but we just need to cover all our bases here.
Yeah.
But I did want to discuss some, as I always do at the end of the Minutia Mem, which was fantastic, might I add. Thank you very much for that. I think you knocked this one out of the park. And as I always like to do at the end of the Minutia Mem, I like to talk about the broader stories in Ukraine that inform what happens in the Minutia Minute. And I do think probably the most pertinent one, we had already gone over the situation in Belgorod. But this is the drive for conscription. Now, we discussed Umarov's statements about bringing the diaspora home, and we discussed the push for another mobilization wave. And as we see it continue, more and more videos of the vanning of just any military-aged man on the street in Ukraine, all across the country, continue. And, I mean, Arestovich...
There was a New York Times article.
Yes. And
body snatchers. They called it body snatchers.
Well, I saw another article. Maybe it was WAPA, one of these other hack outlets, but I didn't see the body snatchers one from this. But actually, Arestovich, on top of his statements from last episode that we cover, is now calling for, and I quote, mass unrest in Ukraine to prevent this. And this is accompanied by articles that maybe Ukraine can win this war without all of its territory. You have Timoshenko coming out, who changed her political positions every 2 years, and is now saying that Ukraine...
Remember when she said nuke Russia?
Yeah, and now she's saying Ukraine has to sue for peace because we've lost this war. Now, she didn't say it in quite those words, but that's the message she was conveying with
That's her plan B.
Yeah, that's... nuke Russia, if that doesn't work, concede territory. That's... it's rational. That's it's a realist position I can respect. But you do see this coming down the pipe, and you do see the failure of the waves of mobilization because you have any military-aged man, and even those above and below, because they're getting desperate, in hiding. There was a business where the owner, who was well over military age, told the recruiters to leave, that he wasn't going to take his employees. And this is what's coming more and more common across Ukraine. And actually, as part of the story, something I had discovered in doing some digging, trying to figure out about the mobilization waves and the body snatchers, the New York Times referred to them, is actually in summer 2023. I had missed the story, but in summer 2023, the Russian Ministry of Defense had set up an emergency radio channel, particularly for Ukrainian conscripts, and that I
Yeah,
believe,
Volga.
yeah, Volga 149 200 something. I can't remember the exact code, but the Russians now, of course, they're going to inflate this number for propaganda reasons, claim that 10,000 Ukrainian troops have surrendered via this channel. Now, I
Mm.
doubt it's quite 10,000, but we're probably talking the multiple thousands just over the past 6 months since this channel was
Mm.
established. I,
Okay, over 6 months maybe.
yeah, over six
Not
months.
10,000, but
Yeah, not
yeah.
10,000, but I could see maybe 5,000. I could see them doubling the number for propaganda purposes, but in terms, and that's also on top of the Ukrainians who have surrendered on other fronts, who have been captured on other fronts, because these are particularly the ones that they're saying surrendered via this channel. And there's video footage from these drones that they use to guide them to the Russian lines where
Yeah.
they carry their equipment, they don't disarm them or anything, and they just go into this. I mean, and I know it was towards the beginning of the war, I think they reorganized some Ukrainian POWs with Russian sympathies into the Melnitsky Battalion, and they actually saw their first action at some point this year. So, I mean, depending on how fervent these men actually are about Russia, or whether they're just choosing to save their own lives, we might, ironically enough, see them on the opposite side of this war. And I do think that if this war does grow more brutal, if this war does become even more entrenched, which it does look like the Russians are gearing up for that, especially as there are going to be some very large political distractions, particularly in the United States, over the course of the next year with the election cycle. We're probably going to see a collapse in Ukrainian morale beyond what we even saw. And I mean, I'm just to go back to him, and not just because he's a clown, but because he's been saying some surprisingly insightful things lately. Going back to Aristovich's statement about mass unrest, I do have to wonder: is there a point at which the Ukrainian population just loses all faith in Zelensky and Zelensky and the people in charge of this government, and just force the country to sue for peace by just a massive national strike, so to speak? Something similar to, maybe not quite, but just to paint broad brushstrokes here, something similar to what happened to Milosevic in 2000, where the population just completely turned against him. He completely lost favor, and I do think it is an apt situation because of what the Serbs had to end up conceding, despite the fact that I take two very different positions on these two conflicts, just to be clear. And it does make me wonder at what point is the breaking point of the Ukrainian population, because being a harsh force in some of the territories that have a large degree of population that isn't necessarily sympathetic towards Russia, but also isn't rabidly anti-Russia, is one thing. Ukrainians can stomach that. But when this starts to happen across the country, when this starts to happen in Western Ukraine against the core population that this country is supposed to represent, at least that's what they say in their public statements. When you're sending off European, Western Ukrainian boys to go fight in the place of the Central and Eastern Ukrainians, at what point does it become too much for Ukraine to handle, where they just once again take Aristovich's advice of mass protest? And once again, who knows his motivation for saying that? I'm sure there's some ulterior motive, just given
President
who
of
he,
Ukraine motivation.
yeah, it's given who he is. But and perhaps I have too low view of the Ukrainians in this situation, but beyond outright threats they can make, I don't see what is boosting up Ukrainian morale. And at a certain point, being shot for desertion starts to look preferable to going into battle, and in which case your morale has completely collapsed. And then, depending on how true the stories are about them beginning the process of women's conscription, and I know that there were a few cases of women actually who were on the front lines that were caught, and who knows whether they were conscripts or volunteers. There's no way to really know that, at least at this point. But, and I suppose I've asked this question many times before, but it does seem much more pronounced now moving into 2024, almost 2 years of this war, and wavering confidence from the Western media. Once again, the Western media is trying to do this A/B testing thing here, particularly out of America, and I still maintain that this war is going to continue as long as they can force the Ukrainians to fight it. And look, support will once again be funneled through third parties, through the Europeans, as in order to give America the appearance of washing its hands of this conflict. But
Yeah.
you do have to wonder when it comes to the actual men who have to fight this war, when it comes to the people of Ukraine who actually have to bear the consequences of living in a nation under siege with a wartime economy, how much are they going to take before they either try to escape or before they just refuse to cooperate with the power structure? Now, once again, I know the idea of grassroots protest, grassroots revolution is largely a fantasy, but I mean, when you consider the fact that I imagine Russian intelligence has been so purged from the country that them trying to stage something like this probably isn't going to happen. Although there have been reports of pro-Russian partisans across Ukraine who have been revealing positions of air defensive missile systems, and that's actually why some of the Russian strikes have been so successful. So
Yeah,
perhaps
you know
Russian.
what? Yeah,
Go ahead.
a week ago in the Odessa region, the Russians also struck the place where they create their boat drones. And of course, there was also the missile strike that destroyed that landing ship on the east side of Crimea, right? This is not a boat that can launch missiles. And of course, the Russians on the 28th launched what the West calls the largest missile attack in the history of this war. And I mean, they hit everything: Lutsk, Lvov, Klimitsky, Staromykhailov, Kiev, 22 in Kharkov alone. That's before they hit the place where the mercenaries are gathering, Poltava, Mirograd, Kherson region, Krivoy Rog. I mean, there's just Odessa again. It's just too numerous to mention. And 8 of those missiles that were launched by the Black Sea Fleet. But most of them were launched by Tu-95s and Tu-22s and some MiGs. But estimates are anywhere from like 120 to 190. They're claiming it's the largest one. If it's not the largest one, then it's probably the largest one of 2023. That's for sure.
Absolutely, and I would say probably is the largest one given the what has happened in this war thus far. Say what you will about the Russian approach early to this war, whether they did underestimate the Ukrainians, whether they did want to play this slowly because of political considerations. That's relevant to this
They wanted a
question.
peaceful
Yeah,
resolution.
I sincerely believe that, and with the April 2022 treaty that fell through, this war was supposed to be a tool of political pressure. Not that every war isn't, but more explicitly than, say, an actual war
Mm-hmm.
of conquest or reunification. But now that the Russians have played this slow, now that the Ukrainians have been ground down and support is wavering, they're pressing the advantage. They are leaning into it, and they're making the situation even under more pressure than it was previously. And I mean, not that the Russian elections have much consideration because we all know that Putin is a shoo-in for those, but I do think that for just the sake of being able to tout it, they want this war over before the end of next year. Certainly, they want this war over. I would say,
Mm.
to give a rough time frame, I'm not saying this definitively, but just to stick a number on it, they want this war over in the next 6 months. By we're talking June, July, August of 2024. Especially with that, especially with the delegitimization it would cause in the West on the brink of an election. Not that I think the Russians put too much stock in how the U.S. election turns out. I mean, Putin's own words, however much you want to believe them, are, well, it doesn't really matter who wins in Washington because every 4 to 8 years the government changes, but all the institutions, the policies stay the same. So I
Yeah.
don't think that they. I mean, while they may prefer Trump somewhat on a diplomatic level, I don't think it's going to be a game changer for them. And I think they fully
No,
realize
not
that.
at all.
Um,
Um,
But go
I
ahead.
should I should mention they all those hits they hit the Yaroviv training center again. Remember they hit that place before back at the beginning of the
Yeah,
war
were
in
those the ones that
2022.
Redditors kept exposing the location of?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean now they know where it is, but I don't know. I mean the Russians claimed that they hit some foreign advisors, but we'll never know for sure, right? That could be propaganda. I don't know, but very large strike. But there was also, just to tie in something with what you're saying, the the New York Times had two, and Politico had ridiculous articles like Putin is signaling for negotiations, and the New York Times they had two headlines, but the one I remember is Ukraine concede territory and still beat Putin. Like completely outrageous, nonsensical stuff. But what they're really doing is they're trying to get the public to accept something that it could be called a defeat. They won't call it a defeat. Uh, but that does seem to be the case. I really thought before Congress went for their Christmas vacation that they would come up with some kind of a package. But again, the Republicans did not, refuse to buckle. That was interesting. Maybe they realize that there isn't a way for Ukraine to win this. When Biden says, if we don't win there, we're going to have to fight them, and Ukraine says that, and the Poles and the Germans are saying stuff like this. We have to be prepared for a much larger war. Like I think that's
I
fear
mean, you even
mongering in
you
order
even
to
have the
gain.
Germans considering re-implementing a conscription policy. Now, will
Yeah,
that actually happen? Who knows? Maybe that's a tool to drive migrants out because they know once the draft letters show up, they'll go back to Turkey. Who knows? But there's numerous possibilities there. But in terms of that narrative, I do agree with you. I think it's falling flat, and I think that the Republicans are being allowed to say this because there are
right.
some factions of the regime that just do want to cut the Ukraine conflict loose. That they are exhausted with it, so they're willing to do that. Especially considering the fact many of these Republicans sound like when they talk about Israel, they sound like the Democrats when they talk about Ukraine. So it's
Yes,
just trading
yes.
one thing for another. And I don't. Once again, that's far from a unique take, but
They've got Biden where they want him.
yeah. Oh, exactly. Biden is, and especially with the embattled results he'll be going into next year. Now that's assuming there isn't any sort of completely legitimate fortification of the elections in 2024. It's going to be a rough election cycle for him, and
Yeah.
I mean, take Trump's bloviating for what you will. He speculates that the Democrats will dig up an entirely new candidate that is neither Biden nor Kamala. But once again, take that for what you will. But I mean, I could realistically see a position where, for health reasons or whatever else, Biden says that he is unable to run for a next term, and they try to pass it off to somebody else from the Democratic Party just in order to try to save their position. But once again, who knows how true that is? I think that they've kind of hitched their wagons to Biden, whether they like it or not. But I don't want to dwell too much on election particulars in this episode. I think that's better to save it for a year in review and a year ahead episode, which we'll be doing, of course, next time. But it is a precarious situation when it comes to the sponsors of the Ukraine war, whether that be the U.S., whether that be Europe, with its very shaky position economically. There was a story this week that the Spanish have cut off imports of Russian uranium, which is something that has been constantly waived from the sanctions packages, mainly by a joint effort of the unlikeliest of allies, that being France and Hungary, have worked tirelessly to keep Russian uranium from being in the sanctions packages. But the Spanish, on their own volition, just said they aren't importing any Russian uranium. So, and Spain's also a country that relies very much on nuclear power plants. It is one of the countries similar with the French and the Hungarians when it comes to that. So, we can expect probably more nations to follow suit, at least in some sort of token manner, which will only exacerbate the economic crises in Europe. And any the biggest funders of the Ukraine war, just to put it briefly, none of them are a position domestically or abroad really to be continuing a proxy war. And probably the worst part is for the West right now is if you want to compare this to a Vietnam situation, minus the 60,000 dead Americans, is that it's an unpopular war that looks increasingly unwinnable, but there's no diplomatic back out. Because with Vietnam at least, Nixon could deflect from that. He could go to the Soviet Union and China and say, I've secured detente, I've secured missile treaties, I've secured nuke treaties. At the expense of losing Vietnam, just overlook that because we've accomplished something much greater. In fact, throwing Vietnam under the bus to accomplish those, which I do think, look, regardless of your thoughts on the Vietnam War, was the most pragmatic move he could have made. But once again, there's nobody in the U.S. who can do that right now. I mean, and I think that's very much embodied by the fact that Kissinger just died. There's no
Mm-hmm.
so in a way that era has kind of died with him. So if we want to throw Ukraine under the bus in the interest of some normalization of relations with Russia, we've burned that bridge. We've burned that bridge multiple times just with our
Yeah.
support for this war alone. And I would say up until April 2022, I think that that was still a possibility because the Kremlin has been for the past 20 years, and I would say up until that point, exceptionally conciliatory towards the West. And I do think that their conduct in this war has burnt any sort of goodwill that Putin has spent the past 20 years trying to build with the West. Who knows? Maybe he's far more conciliatory for his own good than he is. But I mean, looking at the direction Russia has taken, I don't think that's the case anymore. And given the fact that this is probably going to be his last term in office before retirement, the any success they have, barring a successful color revolution in Russia, is going to be completely squandered by the fact that the Russians are going to take a very anti-Western position as a result of this. I would say of this war in particular. I think this has shown that it wasn't just that they hate Putin, that they hate the Kremlin. It's that they have an ethnic animus against 140 million Russians,
Mm-hmm.
and even the more liberal elements of that have softened their position on the regime because they see how much the Washington-led empire, the American empire, wants their nation destroyed. And look, I suppose you could say all liberals in every nation are to some degree traitors, but I would say, and even in the West, believe it or not all liberals want their country to be dismantled and destroyed.
Yeah. Um, you know, um, that article uh, by the New York Times about how Ukraine can still defeat Putin by ceding territory. One of the craziest lines in it was, um, they're going to freeze this like a North-South Korea thing, but they're going to keep on fighting. Which isn't like, what is it then? Is it frozen? No. And this basically gets to the point about how they, I think, intend to stop this war. You mentioned that there is no trust whatsoever. They don't want trust to ever resume until Russia is completely destroyed. And so there can be a secession of a very hot war in the same way that we saw occur in early 2015 after almost a year of fighting. Now, there were skirmishes afterwards, but it was nothing remotely like what took place in 2014. And the reason is, of course, is what I already outlined. But and it's not there just to give hope to the basically to the Western audience. I don't really know how Ukrainians feel about this kind of stuff when they read it. I can't imagine that they're happy about it. I think they also smell that the Americans want the Ukrainians to believe that there are secret negotiations for peace with the Russians. And I think the Ukrainians know that there are not. And they understand that this is America basically trying to get Zelensky to sue for peace, um, which in and of itself might reflect that America doesn't have the wherewithal. They might have the money to fund, pensioners in Ukraine, but not necessarily an army. They need, I saw one Ukrainian saying, they need an X number of dollars just to create these new brigades that are supposed to replace the previous ones that they lost in the summer.
I do have to
And
wonder, and I've been sitting on this take for a while, and I suppose since the end of the year. Now is the time to jettison it if I'm going to at any time. You do have to wonder when it comes to Zelensky and pushing him to sue for peace, if there is some sort of ulterior motive in the idea that they want certain factions within the Ukrainian government to overthrow him, to drive him out of power. So Ukraine looks more like a basket case because it will be more of a basket case, in which case it makes it easier for Washington to distance itself from a country that just had a coup or an internal revolution. And like I said, I'm not going to sign on to that theory, but it is something that has been on my mind for the past few months, ever since the war really started to go against Ukraine and as Zelensky really started to lose favorability. You do have to wonder how much of this they want some sort of force within Ukraine to solve that problem so they don't have to touch it.
yeah, I mean, ultimately they want you. They want the kind of like, if Ukraine can't get those territories, then they need to put Ukraine back where it was when the Americans were dropping, various spies and recon units and sabotage units in Western Ukraine during the Soviet era, right?
I
They
would
they
say
want they
actually,
want this to be a forever war, but just a lot cooler, because right now, I mean, for me, they're signaling that they don't have what it takes, to call like the recruitment officers body snatchers is a pretty big deal. Like if you're a
absolutely.
Ukrainian and you're reading that and you're in Zelensky's administration, that's shocking. Like that's a clear signal. The thing is, Zelensky can't say no because they'll kill him. And
Oh,
they
of
won't just
course.
kill him, they'll kill his other tribe members. And they know that.
It would be quite literally a pogrom if that were the case. It would be, and once again, for the context of YouTube, I'm saying this within the context of what these people believe, not necessarily reflect on my own beliefs. They would call it a Jewish betrayal, and
Yes, yes,
that's the
yes, yes.
that's probably the last thing that the Americans want to happen in Ukraine, especially in light of what is happening in Israel right now. That is probably the worst optics that they could hope for, given this. But I will also add on to that with what we have in Ukraine, with all of this happening right now, I mean, there's so many places you could begin from, but I would say one thing that we could look to that would actually give us a model for what's happening in Ukraine is they want to turn eastern Ukraine into eastern Syria, where there's
Hmm,
no active
hmm.
fighting, but there's insurgencies, there's terrorist attacks, there's flare ups, there's skirmishes. They want to have this area in Ukraine along the gray zone, I would say, is probably a good idea of what we could imagine where it would be if the conflict were to freeze tomorrow, of what it's like with ISIS and these affiliate groups in eastern Syria. And mind you, that
Yeah.
this is not unheard of for this land, where there's eternal peace treaties that are signed that last for 5 years
Hmm,
before falling
hmm.
through. I just look at the history of the Commonwealth, and well, I mean, I've touched on this point before, where it there it's not unprecedented for this land to fight a bloody war and sign a peace treaty for 5 years before that falls through and before that war it gets concluded. And that really wasn't solved until the complete dismantling of Poland. And I would say, actually, given the fact that the Polish state was there until 1815, we're talking late 18th, early 19th century when this conflict in this region was really solved. Up until World War One and the rise and fall of the Soviet Union, and of course World War Two being in that as well. But I mean, you had the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century where this land was really at some sort of peace and stability. And we see now, upon the collapse of an era, upon the collapse of an empire, that being the Soviet Union, maybe, and once again, to be gross simplification, mind you, because I know the question of the Soviet Union ethnicity is a very complex one, but the Soviet Union as something of a success to the Russian Empire, at least on a geopolitical sense, being a force for stability there. Once it collapsed, it was inevitable, especially with the nature of the collapse, considering the fact ethnic lines were not solved, borders were not solved, that this eventually would balloon into another conflict. Now, of course, people were too arrogant to really see this, but that is, in retrospect, it's inevitability that this war came to a
Mm.
head.
I'm going to mention two things that I think can help us map what 2024 will be like. Um, so basically, what America and company has decided upon with the Russian frozen assets, right, is that they're going to announce basically the theft of the Russian frozen assets on the anniversary, the second year anniversary of the war in Ukraine. Now, there have been Bloomberg articles after articles, but also the Financial Times. There have been economists even who have won Nobel Prizes saying, if you do this, even the Federal Reserve has said, if you do this, it will destroy faith in the American dollar. I mean, I always said that this is very, very serious for America. They're very serious about this. It could be that the Americans look at the liquidation of these assets as a way to continue to fund the war. The 20 billion that the EU is now going to draft out of its own budget, like instead of they had a reserve for 22, but Viktor Orban will not allow it to go through. So now they're going to use like public funds that they had set for their people. That's not going to be enough. 22 billion is not going to be enough. 300 billion, however, definitely could keep the war going for another 2 years if they can also increase their production for munitions and shells. Now, I mean, America has a ton of Bradleys they could give, but they would have to be willing to lose their Abrams,
Well, I was
right?
actually just about to ask you that. Do you think they're going to cross the red line, both in America and Europe, of dipping into their active stockpiles rather than just their reserve stockpiles?
I think those voices are there. Yeah, I think that's a distinct possibility. I think the Biden team completely understands how untenable it is for Biden to run as president, even if there were no war going on. But if you look at Netanyahu's statements from yesterday saying this war in Gaza will go on for a few more months, and that's partly because they're not effectively getting rid of Hamas. The Israelis have withdrawn from Khan Yunis in the north. Um, when you look at a battlefield map, right, and you look at the territories that the Israelis control, you'll see gun icons that basically. I'm going to send you one. You're going to see gun icons that more or less say that actually the fighting is happening even in areas that the um, that the Israelis control.
And mind you, that the
Um,
Egyptians and the other Arab states have put their foot down and said that we're not going to take the Gazan refugees because we know that they're never going to go home, and we're not going to want to absorb this problem, especially in the case of Egypt, where you still have a low level insurgency going on in the Sinai Peninsula. They do not want angry, radicalized, displaced Gazans with nothing left to lose to be pushed into that situation where they inevitably,
yeah,
many of them will take up arms with those groups. And
right.
it once again, in terms of international reputation, the Israelis have completely blown it. There's nothing that they can really do to save the reputation beyond conservative Westerners, and even conservative is a bit of an overstatement when it comes to that. But when it comes to, I mean, even the diaspora. Now, although there have been a lot of people who have re-embraced their Jewish identity because of the tide of so-called anti-Semitism, a lot of the young diaspora, we're talking the under 35, they are completely wholeheartedly pro-Palestine. They are anti-Israel. They're saying this
Hmm.
has gone too far. This is a colonial project, and once again, and their ethnicity just completely throwing that out the window. Their ethnic interest completely throwing that out the window because a lot of these Jews see themselves as world citizens, as part of a global culture, and they view Israel as a retrograde version of that. They view them as their backwards racist uncles, as as maybe a white liberal would put it, and they want to disassociate themselves with this when it comes to this ethno-nationalist project. Which, I mean, look, I'm just saying that in completely neutral sense, that Israel is a Jewish ethno-nationalist state with no value judgment applied there. But once again, when it comes to the groups that they have traditionally relied on for support, completely out the window. And when it comes to actually Israel itself, you have a lot more of the, I guess, say, moderate population picking up and leaving, deciding that I'd rather strike it out in America or Europe than remain part of this seemingly untenable Israeli state.
Speaking of packing up and leaving, I'm going to send you yet another map. So
Oh,
yesterday, there was a missile attack at Iliat. I think maybe the Arabs call it Sharm el Sheikh, but the Jews call it Iliat. In any case, if you look at the Red Sea, you go to the north to the top. Oh no, I see it. I see it. It's in that tributary, the Gulf of Aqaba. So there's Iliat. The entire town of Iliat, which is a port city, has left. A Yemeni missile made it all the way there. Now, I saw back in early November footage from late October of some of these missiles reaching the outskirts of Ascalon, or maybe even Tel Aviv, but I will probably say Ascalon because Tel Aviv is even further north. In any case, the Americans have been good at knocking most of these missiles down, but this one reaching, I think, has put the fear in them. Like maybe 3 carrier groups in this place isn't enough, right? And that whole flotilla of the willing that the Americans had gathered up. Well, the French, the Spanish, and I believe the Germans have all refused to
Germans and
participate,
Italians, all the
and
major,
Italians,
all the any
and the
pretty much
French.
any military in Western Europe that is existent has denied this.
Yes, Denmark has sent 1 admiral, not with a ship, and the Australians have sent 10 admirals. Again, no ships, just 10 admirals,
Hey, but the
ready to
UAE
give
and the
orders.
Seychelles have stayed in this. It was one of those Indian Ocean islands. It may have been the
Hmm.
Seychelles or one of the some other insignificant micronation that probably has 1 ship at most to its navy.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about. I mean, the UAE at least has something of a military force, not the most impressive, but it's existent. But
Hmm.
the the primary goal, and actually, the story had gotten so buried, I almost forgot to even mention. So thank you for bringing this up, since I think we'll probably focus out on this and then maybe touch on Serbia a little and then close out the show for the next half
Yeah,
hour
yeah.
here. Just unfortunately because of time constraints here.
Yep.
But with that, you have probably the one legitimate use of American military force worldwide is the protection of trade lanes, keeping trade open. And that's if you want to take the most generous interpretation of the situation.
Mm.
And one would figure keeping the Red Sea and particularly the Suez Canal open is a large part of that. And of course, Yemen, and I think even the Yemen and the Houthis have come together on this issue to declare this blockade effectively.
Right.
The Americans, on their own, speaking with how much money we put into our Navy, with how much pride we put into our Navy, this should be an open and shut case. It should be we show up with aircraft carriers, the Houthis back down, the Yemenis back down. That's what would have happened 20 years ago. Now, we can't even do that. And I something funny that came up is one of these NAFO people said something. You're about to figure out why America doesn't have free healthcare. And then this
Mm.
coalition completely falls apart. The Gulf is still, not the Gulf, excuse me. The Red Sea is still blockaded. The Suez Canal is effectively blockaded. You have ships going around the Horn of Africa. And it makes icebreakers that are being developed by Russia and China look a lot more feasible. It makes these land trade routes of the Belt and Road Initiative look a lot more feasible. And keep in mind, this is the second time in the past 2 years that the Suez Canal has been obstructed. First time was much more innocuous. A ship got stuck.
Right.
Perhaps that's a sign of the competency crisis people like to talk about, which I'm certainly going to give credence to that. But then on the other side, you have a deliberate move by the Houthis and the Yemenis of all people, a
Mm.
country that has been shaken by civil war for the past decade, that has cholera outbreaks because the infrastructure has been so degraded by the fighting, with what many people a few years ago would have called bottle rockets. Now, mind you, that of course the Iranians have a very strong presence in Yemen, so their missile program is going to be a bit more advanced than, say, its neighbors across the Red Sea in Africa, certainly. The Eritreans, the Sudanese, maybe not the
Hmm.
Egyptians. The Egyptians have they have quite a bit teeth to bear militarily. But getting back to this, is that either the Iranian provided missiles that are in Yemen that no doubt they're using for these operations and for these threats have advanced so much that they can threaten the U.S. Navy, that the U.S. Navy has degraded so much that they are quaking in fear from Yemeni missiles, or somewhere halfway between where the missiles have improved while the American Navy is simultaneously degraded. And I mean, we can go back to the Millennium Challenge in 2002 with the war games against the Iranians, where the Iranian team, the Red Team, was able to completely sink the Fifth Fleet within 12 hours. And once again, you can say what you will about war games because a lot of it is to justify more funding and more resources towards whatever faction the military might be, with inter-service rivalries, as it were. But once again, now that we're seeing a genuine crisis, in which case that the Navy would be expected to respond to with aircraft carriers with an entire complete blockade breaking force, it is effectively running away with its tail between its legs. And that the Yemenis, I'm sure they didn't do this on their own, and once again, probably outside force. I would imagine the Iranians, probably mostly, maybe to some degree the Saudis, because of just the interesting political dynamics that have went there, have realized. And look, out of everything, this is probably the most detrimental to Israel, because they're willing to shut down one of the largest trade routes in the world in order to get concessions on the issue of Israel. And the question is, how much if the Yemenis can maintain this effective block, and I don't want to call it blockade because it isn't really, but if they can maintain this effective blockade, especially if they're going to be selective about it, especially if they're going to target pro-Israel countries in particular, how much longer is the world going to forsake their own interests for the sake of more Israeli settlements in the West Bank and Gaza?
Hmm.
And I think that's a legitimate question. I mean, beyond any morality of the situation, how much of their own self-interest are countries willing to sacrifice for the well-being of Israel? And I think, given what we've seen out of Europe over the past 2 years when it comes to Russia, certain countries are willing to sacrifice quite a bit of their self-interest if it means thumbing their nose at the right people. And once again, there's a lot of American arm twisting in Europe, but also plenty of willing factions in Europe that go along with it, don't get me wrong. But can America twist the entire pro Israel world's arm into maintaining their policy, even if it means the blockade of one of the most major trade routes? And you do have to wonder, like, are they still going to let Chinese ships through, or are they still going to let Russian ships through? Although they aren't,
They
they
do.
yeah, I mean, I hadn't seen any reports to confirm or deny, but I'll take your word for it. But the question is, how much longer is for lack of a better word, pro-Israel world going to put up with the blockade of a major trade route in order to, stand with the most moral army in the world? How much longer are they? And once again, unfortunately, I
Hmm.
think they're going to put up with a lot, especially the Europeans. They're used to this kind of abuse after 75 years, and especially after the past 2 years. So, but I mean, as this inevitably starts to affect the global economy, which if it goes long enough, it will. I mean, look at how much trade was lost just in the week or so that the Suez Canal was blockaded by the ship that got stuck, and now we're talking about a deliberate action to cut off the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. How much economic loss is the world willing to put up with in order to stand with Israel? And unfortunately, I think that's a lot. But moving into an election year, these are questions that do need to be asked that I'm really curious to see the answer to.
Mhm. Yeah, and I suppose, when I said that there's two events that I think can help us determine what's going to happen in 2024, and one of them is the crisis that's just started in Serbia. I have this feeling that this protest, which ironically the movement or the political party is made up of a ton of other little parties, is called uh, against violence in Serbia. It's the most ridiculous thing. And I saw Serbian flags and I saw one Euromaidan flag. Uh, the protests that began about 4 or 5 days ago, they happened because there was an election in Serbia and Vucic won. And basically, you have these shitlibs in Belgrade who believe that it was fixed. Now, I know they know it wasn't fixed. And
I condemn any notion and to just be in line with YouTube terms of service that
but they need to do something, right? And so they dispersed the crowd, but a few remained. And now I saw a photo, and um, the crowd size. I mean, it has increased, and I'll send you an image of what it looked like today in Belgrade. It's several thousand now, right? They had set up these tents. Ironically, these dozen or so tents were exactly all the same brand of tent. You know that they literally got the money. They went into a store. They bought this one tent. They didn't even, probably the cheapest one. They didn't even like have the wherewithal to buy different tents, so it didn't look like it was astroturfed, but they did it anyways.
I mean, this is
So
straight out of what Victoria Nuland would have planned any other color revolution she was involved
yes,
in,
and
particularly Ukraine.
that's exactly the point, right? That's exactly the point. The point is they want this protest to overlap with Putin's election in March.
And yeah, I absolutely agree. But it becomes a lot more of a precarious situation because you have to remember with Lukashenko going all the way back to August 2020. It reminds me a lot of what they tried to do in Belarus, especially when it came to
Yes,
the
yes.
question of Russia. Well, Lukashenko already being somewhat isolated from the West, although he was courting them at the time the color revolution happens, much similar to actually what Vucic is experiencing right now. So I suppose let that be a cautionary tale. Lukashenko had the ability, just because of the position he was in, to use far more, far more extreme measures on dispersing any protesters and shutting this operation down.
Yeah,
And unfortunately, I don't think Vucic is in the situation where he can employ the necessary measures in order
he
to
can't
put
do
down
that.
a. No, he is. He's stuck too far in between two worlds. I mean,
Yeah.
every country around Serbia is in NATO. Kosovo, which is part of Serbia, is occupied by a multinational NATO coalition. And once again, we're talking even as minor as Montenegro is in NATO. There is no access to first support. There's no way for Russians to bolster Serbia. I suppose maybe a sympathetic ear in Hungary, but once again, as much as Orban might have his business ties with Vucic and with the Serbs, what can he realistically do except maybe stifle some sanctions packages? Not much really, especially compared to how easy the access of NATO and EU forces into, well, not direct invasion, but how easy support could be funneled into Serbia just with how surrounded it is. And barring a miracle, I look. I take no pride in saying this. I'm not happy to say this. I say Serbia's just screwed unless Vucic can employ the extreme measures and survive the backlash. Serbia's screwed.
Yeah, I mean, one of Vucic's female ministers mentioned the day after, basically these EU hooligans paid for by the US, no doubt. Well, I mean, they're saying it's the Germans, not the Americans. And
Of
some
course,
have
the
argued there
Americans
might
love
be
to
real
outsource their
reasons why the
projects.
Americans don't want to get involved in this, but I doubt it. Let's say it's the Germans. But his minister, she said that it was the tip-off came that there was a color revolution planned, um, and the tip-off came from the Russians. Now, I mean, any fool who watches the news knows this, right? Unless you're a complete simp for the faggot West, like you already know this. You already know this, right? You've seen it dozens of times. So her mentioning this, and believe me, I have friends in Serbia. They know this. So I would say that she said it to signal to the West that Russia is keeping an eye on this. That Russia is aware of maybe even as what I said, maybe a much larger play, and that is if we can see months and months of kind of like a Kiev, Maidan thing taking place
Snipers on the
in
roof and
Belgrade.
everything.
But to be totally honest, part of the media apparatus in Serbia is very sympathetic to Vucic. Vucic is, maybe even rightly blamed for, straddling between Russia and the EU. I would say Vucic is much closer to the EU than he is to Russia. But there is maybe like a 25 or 20%, maybe even 15% that he doesn't budge on. And that's what infuriates America and the various European vassals. They want to humiliate them. They want them to place sanctions on Russia. That's the main thing. But I think now, I mean, they would have to be an idiot not to take advantage of this, right? If you can manage these protests into March, Russian people are, they're very aware of the Serbs, they do keep tabs on this. They'll be watching. And they're hoping that the Americans will be hoping, or the Germans in this case, maybe, will be hoping that this is infectious and it will incite crowds to protest before the Russian election. This is their chance. I would say so from January to mid-March, whenever the election in March takes place in Russia. These next 2.5, 3 months are going to be very interesting. I would probably predict, more attacks like the one that took place in Belgorod. That anything to make the public there feel unsafe. And instead of blaming the Ukrainians, they'll blame Putin. That's what I think they're working towards. It remains to be seen what happens in Belgrade, like you pointed out, which I think was a great point to make. This may not turn out so well, only because the crowd isn't this doesn't appear to me as violent. Not only it's not as violent as the Maidan crowd in 2014, it's not even as violent as the Belarusian crowd in August 2020. Like, it's not even at that level. There have been some scuffles. About a dozen or 2 dozen people have been arrested. One policeman was hurt. To me, that doesn't sound like.
No, it's not snipers on the roof.
It's not very serious so far. Now, if Vucic is smart, he's going to work on them being able to criticize, to contradict their own namesake, which is, the Party of Serbia Against Violence. He's going to have to let them make the first moves towards violence so he can justify their reaction. Yes, the West will only show what he did, not what happened, what preceded it. Like, again, the crowd has gotten bigger. But I don't see the violence level there, and Vucic, to me, does not, with all his faults, at the moment he still does not seem to me like someone who wants to leave. More importantly, there isn't a figure to replace him.
No, no, and I mean, as you were saying, well, number one, Vucic is a spiritual manlet. I've never seen 6'3" be put to such waste in my life. Not even with Donald Trump and all of his disappointments have I ever seen 6'3" be put to such waste. Number one. Number two, as you were saying, there are some issues he will never budge on, and I think that is number one, Kosovo. Not even
Yep.
because he is that strong of a Serbian patriot himself, but knows that it's the red. Pretty much everyone beyond the most rabid liberals in Serbia will come down on him for that issue. And number two is sanctions with Russia because of the historical relationship that exists between those two nations, and frankly, for pragmatic reasons. And those are two issues that he cannot budge on. Those are
Mhm.
conversely the two issues that they most want him to budge on. That being the European Union, Germany, and by extension the United States. Once again, it's all one apparatus, but we could get into the particular interests of each within that apparatus, but I digress. And it he does have to play it very safely. I don't know, perhaps he could get the Serbian intelligence to have some agent provocateurs in there in order to spark these crowds to violence if we're just speaking purely Machiavellian, out of pure political interest. Perhaps he could false flag them into violence if he's competent enough to do that, so he can justify the crackdowns. But once again, if it does remain a mostly peaceful protest, it will play on latent liberal elements that do exist in every society, in which case they might make the same mistake of all of their neighbors of Ukraine, where they decide to take the color revolution path and suffer for it. And I think actually perhaps Armenia might be a good parallel to this because Armenia took the color revolution path, which ended in 140,000 of their co-ethnics being expelled from an ethnic enclave that was in a neighboring country. Mind you, Serbia still has this unresolved situation with Kosovo, still has the question of Albanians just in general in the region, has the question of Montenegro and the national identity there, and the question of are they Serbs, are they Montenegrins, etc. There's a very easy possibility that once again, if they start making these concessions, if it does come to that, if a color revolution government does come in power, where they cede the country to mass Albanian migration, like what has happened in all of Serbia's neighboring countries. And I mean, because you have Albanians in Greece, you have them in your beloved homeland of North Macedonia. Once again, they're up to like what, a third of the population there, if I'm not exaggerating.
I think it's they're like 25.
Okay, so maybe not quite that
The
drastic,
thing
but
is there. I even spoke to an Albanian woman at work, and I didn't know she was Albanian. I thought she was Romanian. She was so offended that I thought she was Romanian. It was it was hilarious. And um, I hear something most people don't know. Romanians actually and Albanians share. They're two different languages. I understand. Very different. Like, yes, they both belong in the Indo-European group, but they're quite different. However, there are many words that they share. The vocabulary, anyways.
that's pretty funny. But
Yeah.
I actually didn't realize that there were that many words in common. But it is a situation where a color revolution government might mean mass Albanian migration, even more than it might be happening now in other regions. But it will be a complete capitulation of Serbia because once again, in the minds of the West, Serbia is just a mini Russia, and
Yes.
and we saw that with the war in the '90s, with the bombing of Kosovo, with all of this. And it's also a further way, once again, to humiliate Russia, one of its most uh, brotherly nations, as it were. Once again, we're talking about a nation that ended up causing a world war over such a connection. Now, of course, there were many other factors, but that was one of the major factors, as we all know. And much like the '90s, it's in a position where the Russians cannot send any help to the Serbians, and they just have to sit there and watch as Serbia gets ravaged and torn apart. Now, I don't know, maybe there's some underground things the Russian intelligence can do, the FSB or the GRU, I think it is their external intelligence agency. Maybe there's some sort of operations they can pull to bail them out. But once we're talking about, and once again, Russian Serbian relations under Vucic are, I wouldn't call them strained, but they're more distant than they've been previously, certainly. And
Mm.
Vucic has wanted to walk this tightrope, and I think he's learning what the true price of Western integration is. And especially putting off Western integration for so long. I mean, you look at a nation like, say, Croatia is probably the most comparable, just because of I would say the commonalities the two have when it comes to the breakup of Yugoslavia. The two major constituent nations, I guess, if you want to grossly simplify that, you had them very eager to join the EU and NATO. And while, of course, they do push a lot of the corrosive liberal elements, as they do in all European Union states, the Croatians have seemed to have gotten a bit of a pass with that compared to many of its contemporaries. And because Serbia has resisted the West for so long, of course, they're going to be much more aggressive if they ever do get that integration. Much like Ukraine, much like Russia, they're going to make it the most extreme form of liberalization integration they can as something of a punishment for resisting the quote unquote truth for so long.
Yeah, all great points, and I think that has always been the long-term, like, strategic geopolitical goals.
And with that being said, unfortunately, I do will have to cut it short here. If you have any final thoughts, certainly, but we're coming up on the
Yes,
two
I
and a half
have.
hour mark, and
I do have
yeah,
some good news out
certainly.
of Russia.
Oh, wonderful, certainly.
So we know that have been these sort of rave parties, people getting naked,
Oh,
stupid shit
yes, yes,
libs.
this story.
There was a political woman who I forget her name. She's associated with some kind of politician. Anyways, so there was a camera, a camera. There was a another news outlet outside of Moscow where they had. It wasn't racy like this, but they dressed up in like, I don't know, anime shit, and they lost their jobs. They're not putting up with them, and then, thank God, this is happening. This is the story. This is the crux of it. This is what I wanted to tell you. This is the real good news. Russia is patrolling the thoughts. So I saw video footage, and they are locking up girls, squeezing their boobs into the camera in their pathetic, bedroom in their parents' house, and that's it. Sorry, girls. You're gonna have to behave. It's so beautiful to watch. I'm
I don't know.
loving
Maybe
it.
Andrew Tate can give them refuge in Romania,
Yeah.
in his Romanian compound. But
Germany did say that they're going to make it easier for gays in Russia to migrate
oh yeah, that's after they
to.
were started raiding the gay
It's time,
nightclubs.
only fan girls in Russia need to go along with them. So, anyways, it's wonderful news. I literally saw like FSB officers climbing over like 7 foot high fences and going through the backyard.
That may be based, but I do have to say one thing. I do have a counter to that.
Yeah.
Have you looked at Russian abortion rates from 24 years ago?
Ah!
Have you seen their
Yeah.
HIV
Woo.
rates from 1993?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
Oh
So
my God,
clearly they're
this
not
is
based.
this is like literally 2017 and 18 when when we did Thought Patrol with Sean Sean Prince Hubris. Remember? And Beardson. Oh my God, that was so much fun.
I can't.
Anyways, all that's
I can't believe Putin has made Thought
he's actually
Patrol
done it. What a gamer. He's actually done it.
a national policy.
Yeah.
He's going into the 2024 election strong. He's trying to get the gamer vote, and I think it's going to work.
Yeah.
Okay, I think he's a shoo-in because of that. And for once, we're ending the war report on a good note. So we'll see you all next time in a new year as we prepare our year in review and looking forward into 2024, which you can look forward to probably about next week. We'll see what time frame. We'll keep you posted on that. But thank you everyone very much for tuning in. Not only to this episode, but the episodes throughout the year. It's been a fantastic year for growth, fantastic year for the show. In my opinion, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. I feel like we have been able to talk about a lot of things that get overlooked. I'd like to think that we're not just parroting the same thing that everyone else does. I mean, of course, there's common subjects that everyone will have to touch on at some point. But I'd like to think that we give something of a new perspective to this. So I thank you all for sticking it out for 2023. And hopefully we don't get banned in 2024. But until that day, we will see you next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care. God bless, guys.